Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our last webinar, Parentis webinar on 2022. If any of you just want to make sure that you can put yourself on silent. I'm sorry if my voice is a bit croaky. I think I've got the winter bug has really well and truly hit me. So Gail, my trusted team player, they will join us and jump in if my voice gives way. But thank you so much for joining us today for our important 3 Ps: policies, planning, and procedures. And if you want to say that very fast, it can become a good tongue twister. I know it's busy time for a lot of settings, and I know this recording will be this meeting will be recorded and sent out to everybody via email that has registered, and we've had over 150 people register for this webinar so far, and more joining every second. So I wanted to say thank you for attending this morning, and I will hand over to Gail, who will introduce our amazing guest speaker for us today.
Thanks, Adele. As usual, we're always so lucky to have such amazing speakers at our webinars each month. And I know this is the last one of the year, but it's an important topic. And we're so lucky to have Chloe Webster with us today. Policies, planning, procedures is the topic, as Adele's just said. We know that they're an essential part of everyday life and our everyday practice, but are all of them actually necessary? Chloe's going to unpick these 3 Ps. She's going to help us to keep them simple and concise. So a little bit about Chloe. She's an Ofsted Outstanding childminder and author. She's got over 10 years experience in the sector in both nurseries and in childminding. She's written for a number of early years publications, some of them award-winning. She's a board trustee for PACEY, and she's an advocate for child-led natural outdoor pedagogy. So there's an awful lot of experience there for Chloe. She's going to be discussing the importance of critically reflecting on the content of our policies, keeping them simple and concise. Are they fit for purpose? And talking about planning, long-term and medium-term planning. Do we need to write things down? And really updates to the curriculum, moving away from unnecessary paperwork. So over to you, Chloe.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, I think today is mainly for me about unpicking and questioning perhaps the essential side of our policies and procedures, and I think we're all very critically reflective in our practice in general, but I do feel like our paperwork and the business side of things is something that we're perhaps less critically reflective upon, when actually we could just be making more work for ourselves. And I think it's often an area that's overlooked in terms of reflecting on, because once we write a policy or a procedure, we generally don't ever really look at it again until we need to. So today is about starting to be critically reflective on how we can start to maybe bring down our workload in terms of our expectations and how we can use our professional judgment to move us forward. Can I have the next slide, please, Gail? Thank you. We all know how essential our policies, planning and procedures are to the general everyday running of our businesses, but are all of them necessary? Obviously, there's policies that we have to have, our safeguarding, our health and safety, medications, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination insinuating you start cutting those ones off, but I think for a long time in early years, we have gone above and beyond in terms of what we think we need for Ofsted, for our own professional judgment, for our staff teams. But I think it's time now we perhaps look at our policies ahead of a new year. Now's a perfect time to do it, and just see, do I really need that? I know settings have dummy policies, things like, and I remember visiting a setting that had over 450 policies, and I just think if the content of that, if they're all 4 pages long, and you have new staff starting, and you have apprentices and things you're trying to share your values, your visions and your policies with, the content of these have to reflect your visions and values of your settings. And I think for a long time, and perhaps even now, a lot of our policies aren't a true reflection of that. And so I think what I'm trying to stress is perhaps, by all means, let's have the essential important policies outlining what you will do here, what you'll do there, what in the event of this emergency, event of this, what can we do? But does it really reflect your setting, your ethos, and how easily readable are these for parents, for staff? Because essentially that's what they're for. But during your settling in periods, when you meet new families, a lot of them want to know what your policies are on certain things, but are they reflective? Or have you just ticked a box, and have you just, covered and said what you're going to do? Or have you really stressed how you as a setting will support that child during X, X, and X? Because if you haven't, then is there any value in that policy? And if it's not a true reflective of who you are as a setting, are your staff then able to take on board how they are expected to operate and manage in those situations, and the attitudes and values they're going to apply to their practice? Which I think, again, is often overlooked because it's not one of those areas that we perhaps think to be critically reflective of, and which I think is why we should reflect on these. Again, the perfect time now, and it's a great staff learning activity to, pull out a couple of your policies, maybe your less used ones, for an example, during your next staff meeting. Ask your staff to read them, ask your staff to maybe perhaps discuss what they think these policies mean and are trying to get across, in order to see if they've really understood the message behind it and what you're trying to express in that. And I think if you're getting differing viewpoints, or you're not getting anything meaningful from, and I believe this is how we do this, then perhaps it's time to either evaluate on, do we really need this? Are our staff, completely up to date? Are we conveying this message to parents 100% across the board? It fully encompasses who we are as a setting? Or does it need to either be edited and made more concise, and your vision and values expressed more explicitly? Or can it just be done away with effectively? And I think if you just, not all of them, have to be reflective with staff, but I think it's a good part of professional practice to pull out the ones that you've written years ago and haven't looked at in a while, because settings grow and change and develop as the staff team grows and changes and develops. And I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of that, because essentially your setting is a reflection of you, your vision, your values, the attitudes and ethos and love that your staff portray. And if your policies aren't reflective of that, then perhaps they're no longer fit for purpose. Can I have the next slide, please, Gail? And which again, I think is very, so it has to be reflective. And I know from previous experience of writing policies, we love to be wordy in early years, and we love to overcompensate and say things within full paragraphs but I think we now need to look at, especially with the move away from paperwork and trying to reduce staff workload. I think if you're going to keep the policies, absolutely fine, but perhaps is there a way of making it more concise, breaking down the information so it's easier to digest for parents and practitioners? Because on those visits when parents ask to read certain policies, do they have time to sit and read 4 pages of the same policy? Perhaps not. But if it's something that you can express in short, concise sentences or paragraphs, I think that holds a lot more value than your 4-page policy, because you feel like you needed to perhaps include every single piece of information. I think parents need the basics, the bare minimum of what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're doing it, the benefit, impact on the children, and essentially that's it. Because policies aren't for Ofsted. If you can talk about why you do things the way you do and your policies say what they say, if you can not prove, I don't like that word, but if you can get across the visions and values and the ways in which you do things and you're confident in why you do that, then they don't need to look at your 4-page policy and all of the huge amount of content that's within them. So I think there's a benefit in breaking it down for workload purposes, and also just to ensure that it is portraying what you want it to portray. And if it's too wordy and it's too lengthy and it was written 10 years ago and you haven't reflected on it since, is it still fit for purpose? Are you even doing some of the things that are still written in your policies? Because again, I think it's one of those things that once you've written it, you've shared it with everyone, put it in your policy folder. When was the last time you looked at it again? How has practice and your settings pedagogy developed since then? Because it does. And in early years, everything is ever changing. And, you know, with new guidelines, are they reflected? You know, because we obviously all made a COVID policy when that came about. But again, now, when was the last time we looked at it? Since the last load of guidelines came out for early years in education, when have we looked at it again? Can we go back through that now? And now we know more, now we're in a better position. Can we take some of that, the huge amounts of information out, and just outline what we will do in the event of an outbreak? You know, it's using COVID as an example, obviously, but it's very much now reflecting on the purpose and the usability of these policies and procedures that we've had in place for years, because it's definitely one of the first things to go stagnant. Practice changes, people's attitudes changes, people's knowledge changes and develops, and that then affects how they teach and how they facilitate learning. But are these policies and procedures that you have said are the baseline of your setting, are they still fit for purpose in the event of these changes and these new attitudes and learning styles? And do the staff that are now coming in and working for you, do they understand them, and do they understand why you do the things you do? Because if your policies and procedures aren't reflective of this and your overall settings, attitude and pedagogy, then you're sort of already setting those new staff up to fail by thinking, oh, actually, we don't even do that anymore. So I think now's a great time to reflect on that and ensure that the staff team that you have with you, that you're taking into the new year, the new academic year, that the things that you have in place and the policies that you have are reflective of who you are as a setting and, you know, your staff. And I think it's very much, and in terms of planning, I think that is, again, it's always been a bone of contention for our sector, and we've always had reams and reams of evidence and paperwork for our planning. But I think with the evolution of in the moment planning and many settings still choosing to adopt this, again, it's time to reflect, is this what we need? Are short-term, medium-term plans a thing of the past? You know, we've all had those staff meetings 10 years ago where we planned what we was going to do for 6 months without even probably taking into account the interests of our current cohort of children, but when we were just doing things because we thought we had to do it. You know, the September classic theme of All About Me, as we got a new cohort of children, is that beneficial? Are the children in your current cohort, are they capable of, you know, expressing that? Are they particularly interested in talking about themselves in that way? And are we just churning out age-old activities and experiences because that's the way we've always done it? And I think for a sector that's so often overlooked at the moment, we are the foundations of education. And if we don't start overhauling and changing the way we do things and critically reflecting on what we do now, then as these children move up through the education system, they will just be constantly given the things we've always done because that's how we've always done it. So I think not only for your policies and procedures, but I think critically reflecting your planning, the opportunities you're providing and why you're doing it. I think being in the moment plan, it offers so much flexibility and opportunity for you to tune into your children as individuals. And by reflecting back upon, oh, but we always did, people who help us in July, you know, the jobs the jobs week and stuff like that. That's fantastic. But what happens if those children express an interest in the fire service in February? Are you not going to tune into that because we've already planned to do it and we've got fire station visits 2 months later? I think it's important to reflect on this again with your staff. Do they understand why in the moment planning is so beneficial? Do they understand why it's so important to be flexible and responsive in terms of children's interests and their learning styles? And are they capable of adapting these opportunities to fit in with their current cohort of children, individual children's needs? Because for some children, planning that far in advance just won't work. Some children are here and now, and this is what we're going to do, and they might change their mind tomorrow. And I think as practitioners, it's so important for us to reflect and go, am I doing this because I think I should do it? Or am I doing it because there's a benefit to my children? Which I think we all get into that mindset of, well, it's Christmas, so we need to churn out 50 Christmas cards. But do we? And do these Christmas cards have to be perfect? Do they have to be, you know, the age-old handprint reindeers? And does it have to be that? I don't think so. I had to critically reflect on my practice a number of times, and I was very much in the, but it's how we've always done it mindset, and it just doesn't work. And now we just provide a number of bowls of tinsel, beads and baubles and glitter, and our children literally just stick their representation of Christmas onto a card, talk about the colours that they see, what they're making. Some of them were using bows to create Christmas trees this week, but that for me, that holds more value than the conveyor belt Christmas handprints, which I think again is fair, because we always want every child to have a Christmas card, and I get it, I totally get that. But is it beneficial if they're not learning anything from it? They're just learning that we're not listening if we say, come on, we're all sitting down and we're all doing Christmas cards and we're going to do it this way. And I think it's, as much as we're trying to balance parental expectations in terms of what they expect their children to produce by the end of the term, I also think it's important to think, but what are we telling those children? Obviously, you know, we all want a Christmas card from our child at the end of term, but not to the detriment of them, and not to know that they haven't really been able to think creatively or provide their own representation of what we've been of Christmas and what it means to them, because a handprint reindeer essentially means nothing to them really. But I think, yeah, and I think it's time now. And if we start that now, and new staff that come in, if they see the value in those interactions and the things we plan and the opportunities we plan, and less about activities and a product, and more about experiences. How are we offering the experience of Christmas, as an example? How are we furthering that interest in fire engines? Are we just putting a few more vehicles out? Are we putting a few dressing up outfits out? Or are we watching videos on YouTube? Are we going for a walk to our local fire station? Because we can, and because we're being responsive, and because we're listening and tuning into those interests. I think once we get away from the tick box of that, the learning becomes so much more valuable. And by ensuring that all of our staff are, you know, sharing that same ethos and approach to learning, then I think we can overhaul this whole tick box approach. And thank you, Gail. And again, with writing it down, there's a whole thing about observations, and updates to the curriculum recently are moving away from the paperwork and from focusing more on practitioner knowledge of your children. And I think we've always had that mindset of evidence for Ofsted and why we should do these observations. And observation assessments are essential parts of learning and parts of our profession. But again, are we expressing to our staff teams the value of this evidence? Are our staff just taught to do 3 observations on that child because that's their focus child for this week? Is that why? Because what's the quality of the observations you're getting? Are they wow moments? Is this stuff that we know the children can do already, but we're ticking a box to say we've observed that child? And I think so it can feel like you're not observing, but we're observing all the time. And I think a practitioner's knowledge of their child and why that child plays the way they do, the reason that, you know, the family background to which attributes the child's character and the way they play and their approach to learning and their interests and how they access certain areas of provision, why they don't access certain areas. If we know that ourselves as their key people, do we need to write that down? Or is our knowledge and our experience and our subsequent offerings for that child much more valuable than 7 observations in a week for stuff that we already know? I think with the updates to the curriculum, there is a lot more focus on we don't need to write it all down. If we can talk and explain why these children do the way they do, and just focus on writing down those wow moments and observing those, wow, I didn't know they could do that, as the person that knows them best, then I think there's so much more value in that than 4 observations that essentially say stuff that everyone already knew, but we were just ticking a box to say that we've observed that child in that area. And again, I think it's cascading that down to the value of good quality observations. You don't have to have 5 observations that say exactly the same thing, because if you're just churning that out every term, then there is no value in that. You're not seeing that progression. But if you're focusing on those wow moments and trusting your own professional knowledge and judgment, then there's much more value in the observations that you do write down and that you do document. And so when you do come to, summarize their learning at the end of term or write their school report or their 2-year check, then it will instantly come across that your knowledge of that child far outweighs anything you've written down, because when you are finally putting it onto paper, finally expressing everything you know and the things that you've observed over a certain period of time, the value will speak for itself in that. So yeah, I think just across the board for procedures, policies, and our planning and our observations and assessment, there is no better time than now to start critically reflecting on, why do we do this? Do we even still do this? How can we make this easier for everyone? How can we communicate our values and our vision and our pedagogy to everyone, and ensure everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet, and that the children are getting the best that they can from the setting, from the practitioners, and from the learning environments and experiences that we're providing via the planning. So yeah, and I think New Year is fantastic. I mean, for this webinar, perhaps, December, not the right, but I think in terms of what we're trying to achieve, I think a new year is a fantastic starting point for those professional reflections, those professional discussions, critical reflection. I think it's a perfect time. And then you can go into a brand new year knowing that you're going to be making valuable changes and changes that are going to benefit your business, your staff, your parents, your children. And I think change is scary, especially in our sector, because we do see so much of it in various ways. But I think for something that's often overlooked and something that gets stagnant very quickly, I think it's a really valuable learning and training resource for staff teams and settings, just to reflect on, not frequently, once a year, once every 6 months, as necessary. I think is a really beneficial professional development tool.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really insightful. We've had quite a lot of questions come up already. I know some of you put in the chat, and I know a lot of people messaged Gal and myself privately. So if it's okay with you, Chloe, if we ask you a few questions. Yeah. Brilliant. So I know you covered the long-term, short-term kind of on the spur moment planning, but in your setting, what would you say is the ideal long-term planning? And do you involve your staff when you're planning kind of the work, the kind of curriculum, the activities? How long in advance do you do that?
We're very much in the moment planners, and we generally at the beginning of the year we will sit together and research and discuss and find out key days in terms of that are coming up, Easter, Christmas, Diwali, Eid, and key celebrations for like children in need, stuff like that. So we sit and we have a calendar of events, as it were. I think it may still be called that. And yeah, we sit and do that at the beginning of the year. But we are very reflective of, we can look at it and go, oh, next week's children in need. And we're big on fundraising, and, you know, but we also reflect upon, is that going to be valuable for our children? Are the children that we've got, are they going to understand why we're doing that? And how can we adapt, you know, how can we adapt activities? Because we're in a mixed age group setting, and so we have to, you know, reflect very critically on how we can incorporate this and the value that it's going to have on the children. So for our youngest children, great, you know, spotty activities, colour, early introduction to colour. For our older children, understanding about differences and supporting charities and why we support children in need. But yeah, I think we basically do that. We don't plan our activities. I'm saying it, the bad things. We don't plan the activities at any point in advance, unless it's like a week or so in advance, because we don't know where our children will be, what their interests will be, and how we can adapt and how we can introduce these topics and themes to them effectively. And we don't, I think it's important to note that we celebrate days and events, but we don't have set topics and themes. We take the children's lead on that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Sorry for coughing.
That's right.
One of the questions we had is, how much do Ofsted look at the policies when they've attended your setting? Because we've had mixed reviews. Some settings have said they literally go through it with a fine tooth comb. Other people have said, you know, when you had your Ofsted inspection, how much of the policies and procedures did they actually look at?
They asked to see our policies folder, and they sat with it for a little bit. I don't think they read them word for word. But again, we had the bare minimum in terms of policies, because I know some settings that I've been in previously have, as I said, hundreds. I think if plucking a number from the air, I think we've got about 20-25 policies. They're all one page for the most part, and yeah, we reflect on them yearly sometimes. Some of the, obviously the statutory ones, you know, less so, but yeah, they didn't spend tons of time on them, but they would ask questions on some of the content of them, which I think is why it's important to express how vital it is that your staff understand and do know the content of these policies, as well as the managers and leaders do, so that if they are questioned, because otherwise it's a top-down approach, isn't it? If that information is not cascaded and isn't expressed to all staff, and Ofsted then decide to question that member of staff who maybe hasn't read the policy or has read it, but there's so much information that they haven't been able to retain it, then that, I think, shows the value of that. Because yeah, they did ask us about some of the content in some of the policies, and we were able to confidently express what was in it because they were so concise.
Brilliant. Okay, that actually leads me quite nicely in it, because one person I've asked, how often do you review that with your staff? That you've just kind of said that. So again, do you do that just as an induction, or do you do that throughout, you know, the duration? And how did you refresh this with your staff?
Yeah, I think anytime any new person comes in, they get the policy folder, they get time to sit and read through it. And I think because they are so concise, that yes, it is a lot easier for them to retain the information. But again, whenever there's a new policy, like I mentioned, the COVID policy, it's the only one I can sort of pull out that we would have had recently that was new and was under constant review, and we changed it constantly. And whenever we update a policy, we also email it out to the parents, so that they are 100% on where our policies and procedures are overlapping and how it will affect them. And it's very much the same. Once we've updated a policy, it's shared with parents, staff. If there's new ones, they're shared before they go into the folder in there, because then we take feedback from them, because we've had feedback from parents before saying, actually, I don't really understand what you mean. in certain aspects of that policy, which has led us to go, oh, maybe we need to break that down a bit more. So yeah, whenever it's new, whenever it's updated, and whenever someone new comes in, they're shared and reviewed then.
Thank you so much. I'll pass you over to Gail, because I know she's got some questions as well.
Thanks, Adele. Chloe, yes, we just have a few more questions for you. Mduaku has just asked, staff are often asked, how do we measure children's development within the moment planning? Because obviously it's very spontaneous. How do you manage that?
I think that's where the value of having the key person system and knowing your children, I think, is key. And Ofsted will look at that far more than they will look at any observation. They don't have time to read through the countless observations, but you can prove whatever you'd like through the observations that you've written down. But do Ofsted have the time? And I don't think they don't effectively. And we all know from, Ofsted inspections, when they choose, they ask you about that child, tell me about them, where are they at, how have they developed, what's your next steps? If you know that, you're going to know that. I think once you've got that sound knowledge of these children, even within in the moment planning, you don't have to write that down to know that amount of information. And I think as long as there's someone in that staff team that has those key children, know them all as well as they do, then I think it's easily adaptable to, as long as you can talk about it and you're confident in your knowledge of your children, then in the moment planning can only enhance that knowledge, because you're seeing there and then how that child is learning, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, how they're responding to what you've put out, the interest that they've come in and what sparked that. I think that knowledge and that sound knowledge in the moment planning just benefits that. And I think it's just as easy to see that development. But I think a lot of staff don't have that confidence. So I think there's an element of role modeling to be done there, in terms of, I understand you want to write it down to show why they do that, but just talk to me about that child. And maybe pre-Ofsted coming in, do those role plays with your staff and just sit down and go, oh, can you tell me what they're doing at the moment, why they're doing that, and why have you put that out for them? Because you know why you're doing it. It's just, I think, the fear of someone questioning it. But just have confidence in your knowledge of those children, because you are their key person. You are the person that's providing these opportunities, and you're doing it for a reason, whether you realize it or not. Which I think as we get more experience, you do forget that, no, I'm doing this because I know that child and I know that it will further their learning. And I think, yeah, confidence, and you can very, very much through early in the moment planning still express those exact same learning goals, next steps, and meet those criteria.
Thank you. Thanks for that very comprehensive answer. Thanks, Chloe. Nikuru is asking, Chloe, is it possible to share your policies with me? I have difficulty condensing it. We'll have your contact details on the email that goes out afterwards, Nikuru, so you can perhaps contact Chloe separately for those. But she also asked, do you share all the policies with parents? Which ones do you share with parents? I know you mentioned earlier about emailing the parents, getting the parents involved, and I'm assuming you probably pick and choose those because you only have the vital ones that you probably share more than perhaps some that have loads more. Yeah.
So whenever a new family start, they have time to go through our policy folder and they can read all of them if they want, because for some families there can be more important policies than others. So from the outset, all of our policies are shared with them in terms of they get an opportunity to sit down and read them. And we're very clear on, if you want to have copies of them to read in your own time, absolutely, we'll email them over. And then, yeah, as I said, whenever there's new ones that come out, we email them out. And if we make a change or an update, they're emailed out. But yes, they all have a period of where they can look at all of them, but it's generally when they start, and so then they won't see them again until we've updated or reviewed them or changed something within it. Okay, so another question that's come in, but I was actually going to ask it myself. What would you say off the top of your head would be your top 5? You've got 5, you've only got 5 that you're allowed to do. What would be your top 5? Safeguarding policy, health and safety, the lost child policy, medication, and again, it depends, because obviously we're up there in terms with baby, because there are some that are essential for baby rooms, and
okay, you can have more than 5.
so yeah, so I've said those 4 definitely, and I think on reflection now, our whole COVID-19 one and any outbreak, let's say, so that, but a lot of ours cross-reference too.
Right.
So for our illness policies, they cross-reference into our medication policy, and we also try and make them concise that way by going, for more info, please refer to our medication policy. So I think where we cross-reference some of them too, that is where I'd go with it. But yeah, those would be my top 5.
Thank you. That leads very nicely into our last question, actually. So you mentioned an infections policy. So what about new, I don't want to say new infections, but new outbreaks like scarlet fever or group strep A? Would you have something, a template that you would then change? Somebody's asked how would you urgently be able to put those together?
Yeah, so whenever there's anything, it's like when monkeypox was doing the rounds, I think last year or beginning this year, we always send out whenever there's a new outbreak, but whenever there's something new like this, and like scarlet fever, we always access the NHS guidelines, put together a brief email on, this is currently going around, please refer to NHS guidance, because that's, if it's something that we're just going to be following NHS guidance on terms of exclusion, how we'll manage it, then we will just send an email, and then with an attachment of NHS guidelines, what the NHS guidelines say, and if they have any other questions about how we'd manage that, then they can come back to us with that. Because again, you could potentially be having a policy for something that may not impact your setting in any way. But if it happened that we then needed to, like COVID-19, because obviously we sent out that email at the beginning of COVID-19, but obviously everything then changed. So then we had policies before we reopened, we had policies when we were in different tiers, we updated the, and so, but yes, no, we'd send an informational email and attachment NHS guidelines, because that we would be following as a baseline.
Right.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My goodness, that was really, I've made loads of notes. I know we've had a lot of apology messages just coming to Parental this morning. Just a lot of people are saying 9 o'clock, it wasn't a great time. So thank you for that feedback. We take that on board. But thank you for everybody who has attended. And Chloe, thank you so much for you as well for joining us today. I know this is a difficult time for a lot of people with like in settings of nativity plays and preparing for the end of year. So thank you so much for joining us for today. We will have another webinar that's already been planned that you can register now on parental.com for our webinar for January. So please have a look. And thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely day, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you.